Julia, and of course, Cork City University for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's also the first time I'm able to speak about my research in a more international setting. So I'm really glad that I'm here, that I could make it. And I hope that what I'm going to tell you today will be interesting for you. And I'm really looking forward to hear your questions and see if we can have a lively discussion on some of the topics that I will try to cover. And let me just start my presentation. So
you can share your screen so that
it's going to be easier for you to follow what I have to say. So let me, we have to do it properly though. Just a second. So now, no, it's,
okay.
no, I have to.
Sure.
Yeah, no, if I do that, you will see my slides, but not, see, it's, now the cursor has disappeared again. It's always so complicated. Oh, but now it is working. Okay.
No, it's only working in here, so we need to, as if we didn't try this 25 times. Okay, now if we go here, and if you start from here, we should be, if you put it full screen, are you able to?
Let's see if it works. Yes, okay. Does it work?
Still loading.
Still loading. Okay, so hopefully it works. The subtitle I used for this lecture is How the Internment of Chinese Migrants in Fascist Italy during World War II unlocked the origin story of the Chinese-Italian experience, because this is, in a way, the subtext of my research, trying to use a specific moment in time to take a snapshot of what the Chinese community was like in at the middle of the 20th century in order to understand how it all actually started. And the reason I chose this moment in time was that since there was a mass deportation of Chinese migrants into concentration camps, their names were registered, their identities were registered, and this is the only way I could actually piece together who actually came from China to Italy in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is relevant because Italy is not just any country for Chinese migration. It is the country in Europe that has the largest population of citizens of the People's Republic. I mean, of course, you have the UK and France that have a larger population of people of Chinese descent. But if you look at citizens of the PRC that are living in Europe, then Italy takes the crown. It's 330,000 people, all of them families, and some of these families are multi-generational. And my hypothesis was that there is a direct link between the Chinese who live in Italy today and those who came at the earliest point in time. So what we're seeing today is what remains of this long process that built up the Chinese-Italian experience.
Sorry, Daniele, I just got a text that they're not seeing the slides moving.
Okay. So yeah, that's what I feared. So let me stop share once again, and I'll try this the way I want it. Yeah, now I should be able to do it. Okay. So it should be one, it should be maybe this one. Oh no, this one. This one should be it. What about now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So this book, it's a preliminary study of a complex series of events that culminated in the mass internment of Italy's Chinese citizens during World War II. And again, it aims to find out more about the origins of this migration. It features a few of the real letters written by the Chinese interned in the camps that were found in Italian archives, some of which have never been published before and have being translated into Italian in this book for the first time. It's not many letters. I found 15 in total, and I only decided to publish, if I remember well, about 6 of them. The reason I only chose those letters was because of the relevance for historical purposes. Of course, there are many more letters written by the prisoners that have been translated into Italian, and their translation is still extant. I have like more than 100 of them. But the problem is, as I could find out by working on the original letters, the translation was extremely problematic, to say the least. Many of these translators actually did not translate at all. They reinvented the content of the letters because they obviously could not read Chinese. And those who could read Chinese, sometimes for very strange and mysterious reasons, they added things that weren't in the letters or left things out on purpose. And the reason I could find some letters written in Chinese within these hundreds of files that I put my hands into was because the way they were translated led the censors to block them. And that's why they were kept into the files of the National Archives in Rome. So these letters are exceedingly rare. Even in China, where I could look at the archives of one of the local repository of materials regarding the Qingtian migration of the 20th century, they had letters from after the war, but not from during the war. So the researchers there were extremely interested in these letters because they say that these are really rare. They're difficult to find. And one thing that I was able to do, thanks also to help from other researchers, especially researchers from China that had worked on the same issue, I could find a way to cross-reference the files and documents that could be found in Chinese archives with the Italian archives in order to find out who these people actually were, which wasn't easy at all, because these migrants, when they came to Italy, they usually used identity papers that weren't their own. They usually bought those papers in order to migrate, and they bought them from people that had just come back from Europe. So it was like the same documents were crossing the oceans and Eurasia several times. And sometimes it would be the elder brother who had spent some time in Europe and had gotten a passport. So when he got back to the village, he gave his passport to the younger brother, who then became him. And so you have that, you know, the identities that they presented themselves with when they came to Italy were not the real identities. But then you had another problem. Their names were extremely difficult to understand for Italian or even Germans or French people that came into contact with these early migrants and had to write down these names and hand them visa and register them. And every time these names were written down, something slightly changed. Their names would be misspelled, and that would be one problem. But then another problem was they didn't use typewriters. They wrote all these things down by name most of the time. And when you use italic script, cursive script, and you write these names down, there are so many chances for potential overlap between an L, an E, and a C, even an S. And so these names kept changing from document to document. The people would have like 5 or 6 versions of their name. So that was a nightmare in and of itself. But then you needed to find out who these guys really were. And that was, when I started this project, it actually was an impossible task because I could not find a way to trust the data, trust the registry lists of the concentration camps. I really had to find a way to cross-reference it with the Chinese data. And thankfully, something happened at the end of the war that made this possible. The Italian government decided to indemnify, to pay basically damages to those Chinese migrants it had sent into concentration camps and to those who had suffered at the hands of the fascist regime. So if a Chinese person could demonstrably affirm that he was mishandled by the fascist police, or that Allied bombs had destroyed his home and taken away his livelihood, then the Italian government would give money to this person. And this was all handled by displaced persons authorities that were in contact with the Republic of China's diplomatic representatives in Rome. So they wrote down on slips of rice paper how much money was given to a certain person, and they wrote down the identity that this person was known with in Italy. And on the side, they would actually take down this guy's name and last name and village of origin, because those were his real, that was his real identity. So I had a Rosetta Stone. I had a place where you could actually match those things up. And at the end of this volume, you will find a list of all the people that I've been able to identify. And this was extremely interesting because it enabled me to go beyond the work that other researchers who had tackled the problem of the origins of Chinese migration to Europe hadn't been able to do. So the people that you see on this slide, Philip Kwok, who was the first to actually study the internment of Chinese nationals in fascist concentration camps, he could not solve this conundrum. And Liv Yusion and Véronique Poisson, who worked on Chinese migration to France in the late 90s, they did exceptional work, but had the same problem. And then Mette Thuno, who is an amazing scholar, she wasn't really that much interested in this specific question, but she was really surprised when she heard that this had been done, that these people had been identified. And even the Chinese researchers had problems with this issue, because they might know who the people who migrated from China to Europe were, but they did not know how they were known in Italy or France or Germany, okay? And most of the Italian researchers that had tackled the issue of the origins of Chinese migration to Italy, they had read that these migrants from Zhejiang were probably left over from the Chinese volunteers or not so volunteers who were sent over from China during World War I to dig the trenches on the Western Front, or to work in factories in France and England in order to substitute the men that were sent to the front to fight. And this story never quite rang true to me, because it didn't really add up with what the children of these early migrants, or even some of the early migrants who lived very long lives and that I've been able to interview in the 1990s, they were saying different things. They were talking about a different sort of experience. So it never really convinced me. This book, which was the only book to tackle the issue of the Chinese in Italy's concentration camps, came out in 1984. And it was seminal work. It gave me a point, it gave me a methodology. It helped me to understand that if I wanted to start working on this issue, I had to go to the most important concentration camp and see what was still there. And so that's what I did. I went to Isola del Gran Sasso, which is in central Italy. And there I could find some of the documents that Philip Koch had worked on. And they were helpful because they gave me a starting point. I found a list of 117 Chinese prisoners that were being transported from the Tossicia concentration camp to Isola del Gran Sasso concentration camp. And with this list in my hands, I went to the National Archives in Rome and started delving into the archives of the Directorate for Public Security of the Ministry of the Interior during the fascist regime. And it took me ages, but I managed to find basically all the dossiers for every single one of them. And so I had thousands of documents at my disposal. And since the only way for me to work on them was to photograph them one at a time in Rome in order to be able to work on them in Milan. You can imagine what that has meant for me. It took me a very, very long time, and I still haven't quite had the time to systematize the whole database. Well, anyways, what happened was that some patterns started to emerge from this painstaking reconstruction of these Chinese migrants' identities. I could see, for instance, that they all tended to come from very specific villages, and they all were linked to very specific lineages. So once you have established that, you can see if there's something that is carrying through the decades from the earliest pre-war times to today. And surprise, surprise, this really did happen. You could see that people that, like, I will give you a couple of examples just to let you appreciate the marvel of what I'm saying. In Milan's main cemetery, the largest and most beautiful cemetery in the city, there are a few tombs that go back to the 1940s. The earliest Chinese being interred there had been in Italy for perhaps 10 years beforehand. So I looked at these stones that were carved with their names, their like Italian names, or their Yangming, as they were called in Chinese, their foreign names. But then to the side, you had the carvings of the real Chinese names and the carving of the name of the villages that they came from. So I went back to China, and I went to those villages, and I took with me a picture of the picture that was found on the gravestone, and I talked to the first elderly person that I met in some of these villages, and do you know this person? And you may be amazed, but most people actually did. That's my grandfather. Yes, I know him, you know? And so I started to locate all the clans of these people, and they were extremely surprised that I would be there asking these questions. But the crazy thing was that once I started looking up some of these people, and they would show me their family albums to show me all the people of their clan, of their lineage that had moved to Italy, I found out that I knew many of these people. Like, one of them was the bartender of a bar that I habitually went to. And I just said, oh my God, this is crazy. So you really have a continuation of this chain migration that is lineage based. And I had proof in order to make these linkages, because, you know, people talk about these linkages as if they're normal, but they're not that normal. This doesn't happen in all kinds of migration. And especially this migration, it wasn't, you know, their historical roots were not so solid. But after I could match the villages up with the names and see who came from where, well, basically I ended up with this map. And it shows me that basically all Chinese that come from Zhejiang province in Italy today, they all come from these mountain communities in the backwaters of the Wenzhou port in the south of Zhejiang. And you have two distinct groups, which are divided by a mountain range, which is also an isoglottal divide. So you have people that are like within the green dotted line that you see behind me, and they come from villages that speak a specific topolect called Jingtianhua, which is pretty different from what is spoken on the other side of the mountain range, which is still a Wu family language, a Wu family topolect or local language, but it's different, okay? And it's spoken with slight variations in Wencheng, Yuhu, Rui'an, all these districts that, or Wenzhou, Ohai, all these districts that these migrants came from. But the villages, they were still the very same villages. And they have a very strong lineage culture that you don't really find in the same way in other parts of China. And that would be interesting to talk about later if you have questions about that, what I mean by that. Anyway, the first question that came to me was, why so many people came from this singular place, which is really small. This area, it could stay within a circle that has a radius of 50 kilometers. So it's almost like saying that, it would be like thinking that all Italians that moved from Italy to the United States came from the province of Como, which is absolutely not true, but just to give you an idea. And we're not just talking about migration to Italy here. All of the migrants that came from Zhejiang basically came from this area, even those who went to Denmark or Germany or France or Spain. And the reason this happened was because of what you see on this slide. The epicenter of this migration was a valley called Fangshan Valley. And the mountains in this valley have a peculiar kind of stone that you can't find anywhere else in China. And this stone became really coveted by literati and scholars in the Ming and Qing dynasties because of its color or range of colors and because of its ease in carving. It was perfect for calligraphers that wanted to carve seals in different styles. So they were sought after in all of China, and people from this valley started traveling and had their own networks of merchants that were habitual visitors of market fairs all across of China. And when China started opening up to Western markets, because of course of gunboat diplomacy and all the things you know very well about, after the 1870s, the Qing government started to sponsor merchant delegations visiting international expositions, like the expos, the kind of expos that we still have today. And the last and most important ones, they all featured merchants from Zhejiang. And among the merchants from Zhejiang, you always had people from this little valley because they were presenting their Qingtian stone manufacts. And they also some of them would also were also tea merchants, and they also had other wares. But stones in the beginning, they were always there because they were curios. There was a big market for Chinese curios at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And the last Qing delegation to come to an international expo actually came to Milan in 1906, because shortly afterwards the dynasty fell. And that was a pretty impressive delegation. It also crossed with a mission that was sent by the Dowager Empress at the time to several European countries to learn about different government organizations and ways to reorganize the army. You know, it was a learning expedition and delegation. They were on a learning mission. So there were some high-ranked mandarins among them. And there was also this really strange things that among this delegation, the most important innovation that the Qing dynasty wanted to present to the world was a very specific way to preserve fried fish. So hence the title of this newspaper, which also shows the spirit of the time, where they talk about a new strange form of yellow peril. That's the language of the time. Europe is going to be invaded by Chinese fried fish. And it's crazy as it sounds, that's what they wrote. And the Chinese pavilion at the expo was called the Imperial Fisheries Pavilion. And it was really close to an area of Milan where you actually had, 10 years later, the first installment, the first settlement of Chinese migrants. So my working hypothesis is that some of the merchants who participated into this delegation, they were actually, they found rooms in this little street called Via Canonica, because there were very few hotels that were actually open to take Chinese at the time. So this was a very convenient location. They were really close. They were within line of sight almost with the Imperial Fisheries Pavilion. So that might be the reason. Whatever the reason was, I'm pretty confident that it was these expeditions that put Milan on the map for merchants that came from the Fangjiang Valley and thereabouts. And so that explains why in 1925 and 1926, when you started having a real, let's call it mass migration, I put it into quotes, then we can discuss it better if you want. But the earliest migration, real migration from Zhejiang started in the late 1920s, in the mid 1920s. And the first Zhejiang migrants to appear on Europe's streets were peddlers of fake pearls. That was really what epitomized them. They were exotic because they were all Chinese. They were all Chinese men, young Chinese men, very well dressed, very polite. And they had their arms festooned with these chains of fake pearls. And they were really cheap, much cheaper than the fake pearls that were produced in Europe at the time. And so the ladies went nuts for them. And since these Chinese all appeared at once in large numbers in the main capitals of France and Spain at first, they made for a good story. A lot of newspapers wrote about them and worried about them too, because of course there were merchants of fake pearls in Spain and France who said, this is unwanted competition. So who are these guys? Why are they here? Plus, these towns, these cities, especially in France, they were literally awash with people doing peddling wares on the streets. There were hawkers everywhere because a lot of men that came back from the Great War couldn't find a job. And so many of them started just selling stuff on the streets. And so France came up with laws protecting their work and prohibiting foreigners to do the same thing. So the reason why these Chinese migrants had reached France and Paris in particular was because in Paris they could find Chinese merchants from their own home region who could provide them with these pearls, which were apparently sourced from what is today the Czech Republic and the city of Jablonec, which is very famous for producing glasswares. And so they couldn't stay in France and they couldn't stay in Spain. They were expelled from Spain. And so in the winter 1925 and 1926, they crossed the Alps and came into Italy. And they came by the hundreds. So Italian newspapers were filled with panic stories about Italy being invaded by a strange new group of young Chinese men who were probably Bolshevik spies. That was the most common hypothesis. And the Ministry of the Interior was really worried that they were spies because there was a Russian countess who had married an Italian nobleman who had written to the Duce saying, I have seen this happen in Russia, so, beware. And of course, none of these people were spies, not one. And they were, their story was actually a lot more complicated because they were actually migrants who were originally been in Japan. Their first destination in the early 20s was Japan. And they were working there as coolies in part, or they would be street peddlers as well, but they were peddling umbrellas. They were selling umbrellas. And in 1923, they were there in Tokyo in a small district close to the Yokohama harbor. And that's exactly where the earthquake made most damages. And after the earthquake came a terrible firestorm that destroyed the city, almost like making actually more victims than an atom bomb. And they were witnesses of this horrendous event. And after the fire came a frantic riot of Japanese people searching for scapegoats for what had happened. And they actually targeted Koreans because they thought the Korean service, caretakers and service women and servicemen within their homes had somehow helped the fire to spread, which was completely false, of course, but they killed Koreans by the thousands. And the common way to see whether you would live or die would be to ask questions in Japanese. And if the person answered with a strange accent or would not understand Japanese, they would cut their heads off. And so a lot of Chinese were killed as well, even though they weren't even Korean. So about 700, according to extant data, were killed. And the ones who survived were put into a concentration camp in Narashino and stayed there for the time needed for China and Japan to work out a diplomatic solution, because China was incensed by this event, because hundreds of people, innocents, had died horribly. And so in the end, in 1924 to 1925, they started to be repatriated back to China, and they all came to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, they came in touch with agencies which were very common at the time. There were banks that also worked as remittance offices, and at the same time, they were making it easier for people to reach other countries. You know, they were like almost like banks, travel agencies, and financial advisors, something like that. And so some of these agencies said, you know, why don't you head over to Europe? There are some people from your region, from Zhejiang in Paris already, and they have opened shops there. They probably have merchandise that you could sell. And so at least that's how I was able to reconstruct this whole process, because there are still many unanswered questions. But whatever the way, in 1925, most of these migrants who had been to Japan actually moved over to Europe. And they moved over to Europe across Eurasia, taking the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they came to Berlin, and after Berlin, they came to Paris, and then from Paris to Madrid. But some of them went by boat, and they came to Marseille, and then from Marseille, they moved to Paris, and then again from Paris to Spain. And then what I just told you before happened. They moved over to Italy. And they were all very, very young, and they were very inexperienced, but they were very determined. All of them wanted to make it in Europe, okay? And, oh, sorry. And in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, the ones who were not sent back by the police because suspected to be spies actually managed to get a license to be merchants and artisans in Milan. And they settled down, like I said, in Via Canonica. You can see, if I can show you here, the Imperial Fisheries Pavilion was right here. And look at where the main city, the main street of, you know, what was then the Chinese district, it was called like that in the 1930s. That's where all these little artisan shops started popping up. And what made it possible to move from hawking and peddling wares in the streets to being the owner of a small workshop, in many cases, was the fact that these guys, who were all men, actually hooked up, if I can use this term, with young Italian women. And these were themselves, most of the time, migrants from rural areas in northern Italy. And they were in Milan as seamstresses and washerwomen and sometimes prostitutes. And sometimes they were also people that were selling wares on the streets. So it was easy for them to meet and become friendly, and eventually also to have sexual or sentimental relationships. And children were born from these relationships. And once the children were born, at that time in Italy, this was a big issue, and it was a common event. There were plenty of women who had pregnancies when they were very young and could not have the men own up to their own responsibilities. So the church usually stepped in, and the Catholic Church looked for the men who had impregnated these young women, and asked them, would you not be willing to recognize this child or these children because they're yours? And if you want, we can help you convert to Catholicism so that you can marry this young woman and make her a respectable lady. And that's the thing. The great majority of these men said yes, which astonished the young women in question and made the families of these young women be usually extremely happy to see them marry a Chinese man, even though this was the fascist era and there were lots of racial constructs and lots of misgivings. But actually, to the eyes of families like this one that you see here, these two couples, what they saw was their daughter marrying a very successful businessman. So they were quite happy most of the time, not always, but most of the time. And the women were extremely happy because having an illegitimate child in 1930s Italy was not easy at all. And plus, they were actually quite confident that they could help their Chinese husbands because they were seamstresses. So it was probably some of these Italian seamstresses that said, instead of just selling silken ties, why don't we buy the silk wholesale in Como, largest silk producing area in Europe at the time, and we cut it, and I can cut them and sew them, and then you can ask perhaps some of your countrymen to sell them at markets, so you don't have to go to markets anymore. You open a workshop, and so they were instrumental to the passage from traveling salesmen to workshop owners, and this happened over and over again. So much so that in 1938, when Italy started to go from a racial ideology that was more tolerant towards the whole concept of race was considered as race's lineage, in Italian stirpe. And so a narrative that wasn't as constrictive as the more Northern European biological form of racism, which advocated racial purity. And the thing was, Italy in 1936 actually got his empire, got her empire in Africa. And then they started thinking, okay, up to this point, we have been very loose on the subject of interracial relations. So many Italians in Ethiopia and Eritrea had temporary African wives. And so we had so many children from these unions, and this has to stop. And so, because we have to do like the British did it, we have to adhere to a core line, we have to be very strict and no more of this thing. So they passed this set of racial laws, which are still remembered in Italy as anti-Semitic laws, but it started out as interracial mixing laws first. And in 1938, they were fully implemented. After the Manifesto della Razza, the race manifesto was published in July 1938, and Mussolini said that Italians should from now on declare themselves as frankly racist, contradicting what he had been saying years before. Then things started to turn badly for these mixed marriages because the newspapers wrote about them in really crass terms, like the one you see quoted here. And then you had, of course, the main racist journal called Difesa della Razza, the defense of the race, or safeguard of the race, where people like Guido Landra, which was one of the foremost racist scientists at the time, actually talked about Northern European women marrying Chinese in Germany and Denmark and France and having bastardized children, as they said, and they said things like the poison of miscegenation have to vanish from the blood of Europe. So, okay, we are definitely into Nazi territory now. And Guido Landra was an overtly Nazi-style racist. That's his kind of racism. So, you had this a situation now where the couples that had already formed, they weren't Italian anymore, because once an Italian woman married a Chinese man, she would acquire his nationality and had to abandon the Italian one because Italy at the time did not recognize dual nationality. So they were Chinese, okay? They were Chinese of Italian descent. And at the same time, so they became foreigners in their own land. But at the same time, any new marriage that was contracted after the racial laws came into place was considered null. And actually, one of these marriages that was actually the last one that was done properly in church and everything and published into the newspapers, it had caught the attention of the Duce himself, who intervened personally to arrest the couple. And the police then asked the woman, the Italian woman, to renounce her husband, who was going to be sent abroad, expelled from Italy. And this lady, Petronilla Castagna, very, very proudly said, I'm not going to do anything of the sort. This is my husband. And if this means that I will be expelled, I will be expelled. And they were expelled to France, where paradoxically they had been helped settling down because they were expelled with nothing, and they had nothing in their hands. So they just appeared on the Monaco coast and the Costa Azzurra, how it's called in English, the Côte d'Azur, and of course, and they were helped by the Italian immigrant community and the Chinese immigrant community, who gave them the means to set up a business, and actually did really well in Monaco. But that's another story. So you have this situation now where the Chinese in Milan and in Bologna, they have been rather successful. Like perhaps 150 of them have become business owners. And then there's about another 300 that are roving about Italy, working as sellers, traveling salesmen for these 150 owners of businesses. So you have Chinese all over Italy. Even though the number was small, they were highly visible, because in every small or big market fair, you would have a Chinese selling silk ties, or they started producing these wallets and belts made out of fake leatherette, vermoide, it was called in autarkic fascist Italy. And so on the eve of World War II, the fascist government had to decide what to do with them in case of war, because they said, we are an Axis power. Japan is an ally. Japan has invaded Europe, China in 1937. So this is going to get tricky. What can we do if the British close the Suez Canal and close up the Mediterranean, and we can't ship them back home? Of course, we can't send them to Russia. So what can we do? We have to intern them into concentration camps. And so they made a list to see how many Chinese citizens were present in Italy at the time. And it came up with the number of 431, which is probably an undercount. It's probably more around 500. Well, 260 of these Chinese nationals, almost 60% of the whole number, were then deported into concentration camps. And these concentration camps are not necessarily the kind of concentration camp that you may conjure in your imagination when you think concentration camps. Some of them were, like this picture on the right shows you a group of Chinese that were interned into the Ferramonti di Tarsia concentration camp, which was very much a Nazi-style lager, with barbed wire and guards and all that. But most Chinese were actually interned into Isola del Gran Sasso, which is a small town in one rather remote area of central Italy, right at the foot of one of the highest mountain in central Italy, which is called the Gran Sasso. And they were put into lodgings that were originally built to house pilgrims that came to this basilica, where you have a local saint who attracted a lot of pilgrimages during the year. And so their accommodation was very basic. It was nothing to write home about. It was cold. It had no privacy at all. It was pretty dirty, and it had very simple beddings made out of straw and very rough cotton. And they would all live together in rather unsanitary conditions. But they were free to roam within the confines of the town of Isola del Gran Sasso. And the priests that were there, they were soon joined by a very peculiar person called Antonio Chang Kang-yi that became their chaplain. And the Vatican sent him there in order to take care of the spiritual needs of the inmates. And the first thing he thought was necessary was to convert them all. And so he started converting these migrants by the dozens. And like in this case, this is a group picture of the first 40 converts that were baptized all at once and confirmed all at once in 1941. And then shortly after, another 41 were baptized, so 81 in total. And this made front page news in the Vatican's newspaper, and it was very much talked about. So huge success for Antonio Chan, but we will see that will not be, I mean, it's not necessarily such a success story as we are maybe led to think. What's going on here? How come I can't? Okay. So the fascist government's concentration camps were spread all over Italy, but particularly in those places that were considered most difficult to conquer by an Allied invasion. So they were put into the mountainous areas of central and southern Italy and the islands off the coast of Italian-occupied Yugoslavia and Dalmatia, like the Dalmatian coast, so to speak. And the Chinese were put into a rather small number of concentration camps, and the most important ones were Tossicia, which is here, Isola del Gran Sasso, which was the largest one, and Ferramonte di Tarsia, which is here, which had a mainly Jewish inmate population. And then you had some punitive penal colonies in Tremiti Islands and Ustica, where people were sent if they behaved badly. And the Chinese that wrote from those exiles, they had the worst time. They said the food here is absolutely horrible and we can't cook our own food, which was, atrocious. If you're Chinese, that's the one thing that you don't want to give up. At least, let me eat what I'm used to eat. But then, yes, among the letters that I found in the files of the National Archives, there are a few which help us understand the peculiar relationship that was built between Antonio Chang and the inmates, because there were anonymous letters that denounced him as a extremely aggressive missionary who tried to convert as many people as possible. And he would buy their allegiance by saying that if you convert to Catholicism, then you can get privileges that other inmates will not have access to. So, as Antonio Chang later became a very well-known Catholic missionary in China. He died in China in Mao's times, and he's revered to this day as a hero of Chinese Catholicism. And he's revered in Italy as well, because he helped a few downed Allied bomber and fighter pilots, and that put him into trouble with the Gestapo, and he was arrested and sent in front of a firing squad. And then he said, by the intervention of Saint Gabriel of the Addolorata, the local saint of the basilica that I showed you beforehand, an Allied bombing raid, or rather a strafing raid, came right at that moment and dispersed the firing squad, and he was able to escape and run into the woods and actually made it out alive. So, okay, so quite a character. But if you read these letters, you find out that there was a darker side to him, because he was actually, sort of strong-arming these migrants into converting to the Catholic religion. And what do the letters also say? Well, first and first of all, the letters in themselves are interesting objects because they're a testimony to a period of time where most Chinese who went abroad could not read and write. And so the very few people who could, they actually wrote letters for everybody. But they wrote them the way they could remember the characters and the way they could handle them. So some of them made unusual choices, like this person that you see here, this letter here. This is written almost like mimicking the italic script. It is written from left to right and horizontally, which was absolutely not the case at the time. And it is all slanted to the right, almost like Italian cursive writing, okay? And the characters themselves have a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of orthographic mistakes. And sometimes also you have very weird mistakes, which make you think that maybe the person could not remember the right character, so he used a homophone. But sometimes the way the homophones were chosen make you think that he was actually trying to be careful, because he chose homophones that would mask words that could be perceived as dangerous, you know, like words perhaps declaring allegiance to the fight against Japan or something like that. And so he would corrupt some words in a very, very strange way, because the characters that he chose were not currently used, were not common characters. So if you forget a character and you substitute a homophone, usually you pick a very simple character. So if you pick a complicated one, maybe there is another reason for that, okay? Or you have letters like this one on the left, which is very interesting because it explains how a big problem for these migrants was having their papers in order. And so because they were arrested while they were selling their wares in the streets, some of them did not have their papers with them. And so this letter says, writes to a group of friends, and then says, if any of you can obtain, you know, my Yangming papers, and you can find somebody that can guarantee for me, can, be a guarantor for me, you know, please do that. Hide the papers into a silk tie so that you can bring it to me, and, you know, under the pretense of being wares that I'm entitled to have, because, you know, those are the wares that I was going to sell. Because the strange thing was, when they were there in the concentration camp, the inmates could not work. So the government, the Italian government, paid them a small stipend. It was very, very small though. And it wasn't enough, because they were arrested in summer, but they had to spend these really cold winters at the foot of the tallest mountain in Central Europe, in Central Italy. And they were extremely cold. And he said, my shoes are all broken up, and there are letters saying, please send me underwear, or give me, and they would write these letters to the Chinese embassy. They would write to the first secretary, please send me underwear. So just to claim, explains how desperate they were. And so they had also these problems related to the papers. These papers were extremely necessary because it wasn't just their personal identity papers. Sometimes what they were talking about was actually these, in Italian, they are called istanze, which is, and they are like formal petitions that you make to the Italian government in order to be freed from the concentration camp. And these had to be written in correct, you know, bureaucratic Italian, and that was really complex. The person they wrote those letters to was this guy, Zhu Ying. Zhu Ying was the first secretary of the Republic of China's embassy in Rome, and he was an amazingly active defender of these inmates. He made everything in his power to get them freed. And actually, he was successful quite often. He is responsible for the liberation of about 50 people while he was still able to do that. Then in July 1941, Italy recognized Wang Jingwei's collaborationist government, the pro-Japan government in China, and he was evicted from the embassy in Rome and forced to go to Switzerland. So from that moment on, no matter what the inmates tried, they could not be freed. and they had to stay, and they stayed in the concentration camps until the end of the war. So most of them actually spent 4 to 5 years in a concentration camp. But at the end of the war, they were transferred from concentration camps to refugee camps. And finally, they were given a chance to be repatriated to China. And the biggest repatriation effort came in 1946 when the British steamer Otranto carried almost like short of 600 Chinese refugees from all of Europe, from Germany and France and Holland and Italy, back to China. And with them were their wives, their Italian, Chinese, French, and German wives, and their children, who were all Chinese officially. And that's quite a story, because all these Chinese, they all came, remember, they all came from a very small traditional area. And when they moved back there, many Italian, German, French, and Dutch wives found out their husbands actually were already married, and they already had children from other wives plural, because some of them had more than one wife, given that they were, successful businessmen that had made a fortune abroad. So what happened to the foreign wives? They could not, it wasn't proper for them to stay with the man's family in the paternal house in the village with the other wives. So they decided, the man decided to buy some very fancy buildings in Wenzhou, like in the big city, and to put their foreign wives there, which for a few years gave birth to a very international sorority of people that basically spent their time, of women spending their time playing cards and mahjong, because they all learned mahjong, and they had a pretty nice life. One of these ladies is still alive, and I could interview her, and she said, "Oh no, it was wonderful. We had a great time there, and it was a very luxurious life. We had a beautiful home, but then the communists took over, and everything ended, because of course now the successful businessmen became, capitalist enemies of the revolution, and so they were rounded up and shot." And so some started to say, okay, the best thing is to get out of here as soon as possible. So some of them escaped to Taiwan, but many decided to come back to Italy and France and Holland and Germany, the few that came from Germany. And so those who came back and those who stayed, because there were about, there were several dozens of people that decided to stay because they had, their Italian wives and the extended Italian family and the children. And how can you take the children away from their Italian grandmas? It's impossible. So they decided to stay in Italy. And these guys are the ones who really made it. And they are the ones who perpetuated migration after this long pause that we have from the Maoist period. During that time, hardly anyone could come out of China. And even if they could, it was difficult because their relatives in China had really no advantage to gain from being related to Chinese abroad. It was considered very suspect to have these affiliations. So for a long time, they kept up their links with their lineages and kin by writing letters, but it was all hush-hush. And that's also the reason why these letters have disappeared in China as well, because they were regularly burned. Letters and photographs, you would not like to be caught with these papers in your hand. In the meantime, in the 1960s, boom came on, and these businessmen became very, very happy and successful, representatives of the boom economy of the time. Almost all of them had a pretty good time. Like in these pictures, you can tell, these are pictures that show off newfound prosperity. And they also had a world of their own because, there wasn't a real Chinese community in Italy at the time. The Chinese were less than 500 people up to the 1980s. But these 500 people, they had extended families, Italian Chinese families. And they had their own world where people would eat Chinese food, even though they were, most of the family were Italian, but it was common for them to get together and eat the kind of food you eat in the Wenzhou area. So everybody, all their laborers and workers in their workshops and they were all Italian at first. They were all Italian, especially ladies, but also male migrants who came from the south. And these people to this day, they know words in the Chinese dialect and saying, oh yeah, we ate this or that, and they tell me what it is, and I can't really understand what they're talking about because they're not saying it in Mandarin, they're saying in Wenzhou Hua. And I'm almost done. So they became, you know, the archetypical model minority in post-war Italy. They were covered occasionally by newspapers and magazines who marveled at how good they had done, you know, because and at how well adjusted they seem also to be in this weird pocket of Italian society that was interracial and also to some extent intercultural. And all these children that you see here that are, you know, the offspring of these mixed marriages, they all went on to be quite successful themselves. So when the migration started up again during the reform and opening period in the 1980s, these lineage ties suddenly became extremely important because most of these business owners, they had enterprises. At the time, it was mostly restaurants that could benefit from cheap workers that were actually family members. So they made it possible for their cousins or nephews to come over to Italy, mostly by illegal means, because it wasn't really possible to do otherwise at the time. And the costs of these illegal migrations started to become, you know, costlier and costlier as time went on. And from becoming mom and pop operations, they started becoming, you know, business conducted by organized crime, but that's another story. But in the end, what happened was that the lineage ties helped consolidate a new Chinese migration that picked up steam in the 1990s and 2000s. It peaked in 2010, and then it started to decline. Now we are in full decline. I mean, last year we had 4,000 migrants from China, and of course it's because of COVID, you might say, but 2 years prior we had less than 10,000. So not really just COVID. It's just that Italy is not as attractive anymore, and China, you know, has been on the rise for decades. And also because those little communities that I've shown you at the beginning of this lecture on the map, they have been almost completely depleted of migration age population. So all you have left is older people and perhaps children that they look after for a time, but then there's no one there. Many of these villages are now basically dead. And so in the story of Chinese migration in Italy in the 1990s and then 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, you know, it's made of a lot of hard work, sweatshops. Migration started to go outside the strict boundaries of lineage and kin solidarity to branch out into making it however possible. And lineage associations remained extremely important. Every time you have a wedding banquet or a funeral, you know, the lineage strength and power is on full display. You can see that, you know, the descendants of one single person called Wang Xuefang, he has more than 500 kindred, you know, people of his family and lineage living in Italy. And 500 is not. It's quite a number. And at the same time, given that the people that were migrating in the 1980s and 90s migrated as families, for the first 20 years, the mixed marriages almost disappeared. You had families coming over and their children, you know, they were meant to marry basically the children of other couples like them. or even marry somebody that was brought over from China. So one aspect of this phenomenon is that this was the first minority in Italy created by migration that immediately appeared with a demographically complex profile. They were immediately multi-generational. And with time, they're also the first to challenge or interact with the socialization agencies of Italian society, like school, work, church, whatever, in a very complete way. You know, you have little children that need to go to school, you have children that get sick, or women that need to go to have their children in a hospital. And so they have to interact with all these services. And this was pretty new for Italy in the 1980s. Italy wasn't really ready for that. You know, you had very few people who could speak Chinese. These migrants could hardly ever speak any Italian, and most of them still can't to this day. Like 2/3 of the Chinese living in Italy hardly speak any Italian. And so, you know, this had to transform the way Italy social services and educational and health services, they had to adapt to the situation, and they had to do that for the Chinese first, because everybody else, all the other migrants that we started to have in Italy from the 1980s onwards, they became a family affair only after the late 1990s, okay? But there's also a darker side to this story. You have an undertow of colonial and racist discourse that frames any kind of conflict you have between the Chinese and the Italians, however it may be portrayed in the media or played out in the streets. And every time this happens, you can see that in the media and also in common sense conversations in Italy, all these long forgotten tropes of racial difference pop right back up. And like Mark Chu was saying to me this afternoon, Chinese Italians and Italian Chinese, the few of them that are left, are constantly exposed to forms of microaggression, like you are probably aware of still exist in so many European societies. And the difference is that in Italy, there are not many safeguards or counteracting forces to correct these representations and portrayals in the media and in the public discourse. So to counteract this kind of subtext in the Italian conversation, I started to collaborate with some friends of mine who are artists, Chai, Rocky, and Matteo De Monte especially. They have been tackling the story, the history of Chinese migration to Italy, partly because Matteo himself is a descendant of one of the earliest migrants to Italy. And they started doing it with graphic novels, and their graphic novels have been extremely successful, and they have been translated into Chinese and published in China as well. And in 2016, we managed to organize an exhibition in one of Milan's most important museums, the Museo delle Culture, the Museum of Cultures. It was called Chinaman. We provocatively titled it Chinaman. And unexpectedly, it drew crowds, and it changed the narrative, at least one part of the narrative, because from 2016 on, the media ceased to look at the Chinese as perpetual strangers, because they had to accept the fact that these Chinese, Italy's Chinese, they have been there all along, all throughout the 20th century. They went through fascism just like us. They went through the post-war boom just like the ordinary Italian families, and they went through all that we are living today, side by side, and most of the time having extremely strong ties with Italians, be it family ties for those who married Italian women, perhaps 2 or 3 generations before, or even friends and work, colleagues and workers and people that enabled them to put up their businesses. And this is part of the Chinese story abroad of the Chinese diaspora story that is left out of so many narratives that are popular among, like many Chinese researchers in China. When they research the Chinese diaspora, they build up a narrative which has many virtues, but it has one big fault. It always tends to talk about these migrations as if they were happening in a vacuum, and they did not. So this is a Chinese-Italian story. It's not just a Chinese story. Thank you very much for being with us. Share. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I have taken a little bit more time, but
That's fine, Daniele. That's
Okay.
okay, actually. Thank you for this exciting talk. I have at least 20 questions, but I can see the face that 20 would be too much. So I'll refrain from asking them at the moment, and I'll open to the floor if anyone has a question that would like to address Daniele, either here in the room or online. Yeah.
Can we start with some multiple relevant questions? I'm a linguist. I'm the linguist from the Asian Study Department of UDS College, and I found a lot of very interesting linguistic elements from your stories. It's super interesting, and you have already covered. You even covered all of the most important linguistic phenomena about the Chinese language. In my linguistic introduction course to undergraduate students.
Okay, great.
Three very important questions. The first one is about the romanization of Chinese characters, the romanization of pronouns like people's name and name of places. So I have a question for that, but I'll come back to that later. The second part is about the subtle differences between sub-dialects of Chinese language, the Wenzhou dialect, different like sub-dialects of the Ming dialect and the Wu dialect, and the Wenzhou dialect, something in between. And the last one is about Chinese character amnesia. When there's the Chinese idiom for that, 提笔忘字. When you pick up a pen, you forget how to write the Chinese characters. It's about Chinese character amnesia. And yeah, in your story, you said some Chinese immigrant, when they wrote the letters, they use different Chinese characters, the homophones, to replace the original ones.
Right.
But they deliberately chose the less commonly used ones. So
Exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I have one question for the first one, the romanization of Chinese pronouns. In the original Italian official documentary, what did they use to annotate their names? Did they use Italian to express the name, or they use Wade dial, the popular version?
No, should I answer right away? No, okay.
First of all, could we just explain to the people
Yeah, would you
online?
mind to summarize?
Could you just summarize the question?
Oh, okay. So the first three questions that I got were about the linguistic aspects of this research, and in particular, one question pertained to the differences in the local dialects and the different subdialects of dialects, if we may use this expression. Very big story there to tell. I mean, it's a difficult conversation, because some of these maybe should not be called dialects at all. Okay, so you have that. And then the question of character amnesia, of having, why were certain characters chosen to substitute for characters that the person could not remember? Why choosing certain characters, especially if they're, rare or even less common than the ones you were forgetting? That's also a question that I'm not sure I really have an answer for that, but I will try. And then there was a question on the specific Italian way, so to speak, to Romanize these Chinese names. Should I start answering? Okay, so I'll start with this question about Romanization, which is extremely pertinent and extremely interesting. Italy at the time did not have a standard for transcribing, transliterating the sounds of Chinese. So there was an Italian system, but it wasn't formalized. It didn't have names, and only people who studied Chinese at the time in Italy, which were like 10, you know, they sort of used that system. It was used by Di Giura, who was the first European to translate the strange stories from the Liao Zhai studio, okay? And, but most people that had to deal with these names, they were policemen. So they had no idea whatsoever on how to transcribe Chinese characters. What they did was they received passports that had been created for these migrants in China. And here's an interesting side note. The Lloyd Triestino, which was the main merchant marine that was outfit that was going from Trieste to Shanghai, they had a very aggressive marketing policy saying that they would provide passports to any Chinese customers who would choose their ship and their shipping line instead of the French one. So the French resented that very much, and they wrote very acerbic letters saying, you know, this is unfair. Plus, you know, what's this with handing out passports like they were candies, you know? But that policy actually produced documents that when they were registered in Italian, the documents were handwritten. So whatever system they used to transcribe the characters in China, it was up to whoever wrote down these passports. So some chose Wenzhou, but that's the very minority. Most of the time they used a system which was probably used by the Chinese Marine Customs system, which is modeled on French. So that also means that you have a lot of names that are Frenchicized, like Wu became OU, okay? Now, Kou Tian Wu, 那个 Wu became OU, but in Italian, OU is not pronounced Wu, it's pronounced O. So that person became O, Mr. O, okay? And then you have, so it's just mind-bogglingly complicated, because then you had people who obtained the identity of sailors, perhaps, who hailed from the Cantonese parts of China, so Hong Kong or Macau or Guangdong. All these migrants were from Zhejiang, but they would buy these documents. And so those identities were transcribed with the system that was used in Hong Kong to transcribe Cantonese names. So they had names like Fat, no, or Hak, or, you know, with all these hard consonants at the end of syllables, which, you know, none of these Chinese ever spoke like that. So, and all these names, once they were transcribed into Italian official papers by hand, they were there were so many mistakes, because when you write in cursive script, whether italic or English cursive script, you have so many ambiguities. You know, a C could look like an L, could look like an E, could look like an F sometimes. It depends on how it's written. And so all these names got changed over and over again. So at the end of the book, I can give you an example of what happened to some of these names. I can use the same example I used today, which is fun. So you have this guy whose real name is Liu Jinbao, okay, Liu Jinbao. And he was called Lan Chan Bao in Italian. And then in several documents, he appears as Lan Chan Pan, Lan Jan Pao, Lan Pian Pao, Lan Jan Pan, or simply Giovannino. So, you know, that's why I taxed your patient at the beginning of this lecture talking about the Rosetta Stone of this archive, which is currently at the Accademia Sinica's Institute for Contemporary History, that provided me with the opportunity to see those names side by side. Because if I didn't have that Rosetta Stone, identifying these people would have been impossible. Just simply impossible. There's no way. Like in China, I met researchers who had compiled an Excel spreadsheet trying to detail all the different ways that a certain spelling of a character could appear in Italian, French, and Spanish. And it was just nuts. You know, there was no way you could look at these spellings, and I could go on and on. I have so many here that are just incredible. There's no way you could figure out what the real name was just by looking at what is written on the characters. And that opens a huge question regarding their descendants. Like so many sons and daughters of these early migrants, or even their third or fourth generation, they have so many questions about who they are descended from. And they say, because they would say, I have no idea who my father was. I don't know what his real name was. So part of the job that I've taken up was trying to source the identity of these people, also because so many of these informants that I talked to were really distraught by this, that they could not find who their relatives were. And in China, the researchers that were doing this kind of research in China, which has a very genealogical taste to it, they really did not know how to solve the problem because they could not speak Italian. So they could not use the archives that I was using, and they hardly knew they existed, even though they were exceptionally thorough and good researchers. But language can be a huge barrier. So that's one thing. The second one, the dialects. So one of my side projects is to try to map out the structure of the Yuhu dialect, which is a subdialect of Wenchunghua, which itself is a subdialect of Wenzhou. Okay, Wenzhou could be considered a local language, Fangyan, and it is a language because it is very distinct from other Wu languages, and it's so difficult. It's so difficult because even just figuring out the tone structure, I came up with about 8 different tones, and it's really a mess. And then you have Qingtianhua, which is on the other side of the isoglottal divide, and that has been described. There is quite a bit of literature on that specific language / dialect. And then you said correctly, there are also influences of Min dialects, because the area of Wenzhou was partly settled by centuries ago by immigrants from Fujian. So you also have that. You have an influence of Min dialects, and I'm not a dialectologist, and I don't pretend to be, but there's so much work to be done in this sphere. If anyone is listening and has a passion for Chinese dialects, do something about this, please. And character amnesia, that is an open question for me. Like some of documents that I read were extremely straightforward, meaning that using homophones to cover for characters that you can't remember is just an everyday thing. So many Chinese people do that every day. So many non-Chinese people do that every day. I guess I do it. Like sometimes you don't know that character and you just write something that has the same sound. And but why did they choose? I mean, I have some examples here. If you're interested, I could show you. And some of these are just mysteries. I have no idea why they did that. And if you want, I can show you later if you're interested. It's quite interesting.
Thank you so much for the detailed answer.
You're welcome. Try my best. Yes.
So first, Jacopo, to you, and then to you.
Sorry. So mine was really like a quick question, which is more of a curiosity of mine since I'm dealing with borders and Italian boundaries. So when you say that they crossed the Alps from France and Spain, I just wanted to know how and where, from which specific frontier, and if there's anything to say about that.
Oh, there is. Some of them. Oh, okay. So I was just asked by Jacopo, how did they cross this? How did they cross the Alps from France into Italy in 1926, in the winter of 1926? Well, some of them came by bus or by train. Mostly through the border Bardonecchia. But some also used some lesser known passes, and they came by foot, so they walked. I don't know how long they walked, but I know this because they were arrested, and there are, the police kept very scrupulous annotations of who was arrested, or there are actually one of my main sources for the second book that I'm writing on this topic, which purports to be a history of Chinese migration to Italy, are the verbali, the the interrogation records of the people the minutes of the people that were arrested. And so those are extremely interesting because they were asked to detail the routes they have taken to come to Italy. So it gives me an idea of where these people are coming from after this first wave that came through the Western Alps from France to Italy. So.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I was just thinking here and thinking about all these interesting experiences and stories. And then at the end, you said something interesting. You just mentioned it again, that the discourse in China seems to be quite different. So you said that researchers are looking at this phenomenon in a vacuum, you said. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And second part, what is sort of the popular discourse of that? So what stories circulate in novels and television drama?
Oh.
And how does that, for example, when the graphic novel was translated into Chinese, how was that a new experience for Chinese audiences compared to what they knew from
very interesting questions. Okay, so the first question is, in what way is the public and political discourse in China being shaped to take into account the Chinese diaspora, and how does it affect the realities of diaspora communities around the world and in Italy in particular? So I will answer this question first, and I'll answer right away. In 2014, something really important happened in diaspora politics in China, because the Office for the Affairs of Chinese Overseas has been put under the auspices of the Department for United Front Work. And I'm sure that people who study China know what that means. So the United Front is a political institution, so to speak, that is meant to provide ideological surveillance and propaganda to help preserve the Chinese Communist Party leadership and primacy in China and abroad. So under this huge umbrella, today come all of the offices that are deputed to deal with the diaspora and minorities, cultural, religious, ethnic. It's all in the same bag now. So the message towards these communities has become a lot more, a lot stricter than before. So now you have a narrative to adhere to. If you want to talk about the Chinese diaspora, you have to make it fit the narrative of the Chinese diaspora being an integral part of the Chinese dream. And so you have to tell the story highlighting the sufferings of migrants abroad, but also their great successes and the great achievements for the glory of the motherland. Okay, it's all for the good of the Zuguo and the party. And when you have this narrative, what it literally translates into is that when you have people like Zhou Feng or Yan Shihai, which are two magnificent researchers that I've met in Qingtian, when they have to put together the museum of Qingtian migration abroad, or they have to organize lectures or seminars, they have to take into consideration that what is in the title and what is in the content of the lectures sort of adheres to that frame. And so what that means is that, for instance, if you talk about Chinese migrants in Italy, whatever happened to their Italian wives doesn't really concern us, because we have to talk about the Chinese, not the Chinese Italians, okay? And even less of the Italian Chinese. There is a very interesting case. I'm going to publish a paper in English about it soon, so it would be nice if you could read it and tell me what you think about a very singular case that happened of an Italian woman who had a child without being married with an Italian guy who left her. And then she went to work for a Chinese businessman in a workshop in Legnano during the war. And this entrepreneur fell in love with her and married her and adopted her child, even though it wasn't his child. And then they had another child, but they moved to China together. And these guys, they did not come back. So she stayed there until the early 1950s, and then she died, probably in one of those campaigns. The official narrative says that she died of fright, and whatever that means. And so because of soldiers that came over, and these soldiers, they had to be Chinese soldiers because there weren't other soldiers in 1953 in Zhejiang. And then this son of hers, he grew up in this village and became a complete Chinese villager. The only language he speaks is the local dialect, but he looks Italian. His face is an Italian face. And so he was the foreigner, forever the foreigner. He married a woman that was, to use a very ugly term, a leftover woman that had no other marriage prospects. And when when her family said to her, why don't you marry him? He will take you. And she had a lot of misgivings, because she said, oh, but he is a foreigner. We are talking about someone who only speaks the local dialect, only eats the local food, has been through all the political campaigns of Maoist China, and he's exactly like everyone else except for his face. We were talking today with Mark Chu about somaticity and its importance and impact in societies who are very ethnically homogeneous, okay? So this is an example. And this person became really famous at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s because he tried to reconnect with his Italian family. It's a very complicated story, and I'm not going to go into it now, but it just gives you an idea how complex these issues are in Chinese narratives of self and identity. And so when Matteo and Chai published the story of Matteo's grandfather, Primavera e Autunni, in Chinese, the Italian version of the booklet that that I've just shown you has Matteo's grandfather and his grandmother on the cover, but on the Chinese edition, there's no grandmother. It's just the father. Okay, her grandmother was censored away. Okay, because it has to be a Chinese story, not a Chinese-Italian story. Okay, so that's, and then the second question was about, help me again, help me out here.
Yeah, so
how the translation was received. Okay, and yeah.
Sorry, no, that wasn't the question. I mean, I think you answered it now. What's sort of the popular discourse on?
Okay. Okay. So I actually answered it.
So
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's tension.
But actually, it was interesting what you were saying just now about the mother being removed from the grandmother of Matteo being removed from the cover and having it as a Chinese story, because in Italy was exactly the opposite.
Exactly the opposite. Yeah, that's the thing. The Chinese Italians, the third or fourth generation, third generation Chinese Italians, they are struggling with the definition of their Chinese Italian identity. They don't want to be boxed in by anybody. They want to be free to define themselves on their own grounds, and they should be. But at the same time, they hate being forced into the box of being just Chinese. They resent being called just Italians, but they also resent being called just Chinese. They say, we are something in between, and we have to find out by ourselves what that really means. It's not up to you, it's up to us. So that's an ongoing discussion, and it's very heated because there are so many intersectional identities that are not recognized in China. You know, how do you reconcile your Chineseness with being a gay Sino-Italian? It's difficult. Okay, we had one of these people write a book called Cuore di Seta. The author is called Zhejiang Shi, and he's an amazing person. But he came out publicly with a book in Italian about his life story as the child of Shantung migrants in Italy, a very, very small minority within the minority. And he said, I don't think I can publish this book in Chinese. I don't think I want to, because it would open up so many questions that. Yes?
Okay, I have Guido first.
Yes.
Yes, thanks. First of all, thanks so much for such a great presentation, a very fascinating topic. And
Thank you.
which, of course, I did not know anything. It opens so many different perspectives to look at Italian history. I would like to ask you about the reparation that you mentioned that were paid to the Chinese that were put in concentration camps, and that then led to this very fortunate Rosetta Stone of your work.
It's a very interesting story because Italy.
Just to know, yes, the Chinese government was involved. It was just an initiative of the Italian state. If you could say something more about that.
Italy has been the only Axis power to pay reparations. Not Germany, not Japan, Italy. And the reason it did so was strictly political. The Italians were afraid they were going to swallow a hard piece because they were saying, you know, we fought with the Allied, you know, under the Badoglio government. We have an anti-fascist resistance. Can we hope for leniency from the Allied powers? Will they help us recover our lost territories in what is now Yugoslavia? Will Trieste stay Italian? Okay, these are all open questions at the end of the war. And so they were saying, you know, Britain and France, they hate us. They hate us. The French think that we stabbed them in the back, rightly so, in 1940, so they hate us. They will not give an inch. The Brits, they hate us too, because of, you know, our imperial pretensions and because of how many British ships we sunk in the Mediterranean and all that. So Americans are slightly more well-disposed towards us. What if we can convince the Chinese to be lenient with us? What if they become members of the, you know, small group of allied forces that one day will reconstruct an international global order, and the Chinese will be friendly with us? What if we immediately tell them that we relinquish all of our territories and concessions in China, take them, grand gesture, by you know, a losing contestant in the war. So there's nothing great about it. But at the time, it was considered something rather, you know, of course, Chiang Kai-shek had already said, there's no question about this. These territories are gone forever. You know, you guys, you just have to go and be quiet about it. But, you know, and then he said, why don't we pay reparations to those Chinese citizens that we have forced to go into concentration camps? You know, that sounds practical and doable, and it would signal goodwill. And so they went on and did that. And they did that in, you know, collaboration with the Chiang Kai-shek's government. And it was all neatly done. And it was quite a thing because all these Chinese migrants came in possession of for the time, pretty significant sum of money. It was the equivalent of maybe 2 or 3 years work by an average worker in Italy in the lira of the time. So the Chinese immediately converted it into into British sterling, and and proceeded to put it into those banks that I was talking about, those banks that were specializing in remittances, and it was a lot of money. So the Chinese had money to start a new life in China, or they could invest that money in Italy, and some of them did, and quite smartly too. So that's how it went. That's how it went. And yeah, I'm profoundly grateful for those archives that still exist, because that's how this work was possible.
I think the role of archives there, it's very interesting in terms of personal, collective, public, private, in the methodology that you use and in general in history preservation. But I think we're going to conclude with Mark Chu's email. Mark, if you want to switch on the camera and the microphone.
Hey, Mark.
Hi again. Thank you very much for that, Daniele.
Wait.
Okay.
Can you
hear me?
We can't hear you. Maybe you have to get out and get back in. Oh, it's us?
It might be us.
It's showing me.
Strange, because it's all up.
Or if you want to write it in the chat very quickly.
The chat was closed, I think. Is it open again now? Okay.
We can't hear a thing. I'm sorry.
I'm just trying to.
Yeah, there should
You
be.
can ring me and I can put it on TV.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. You could. Yes.
It's antiquated methodology.
But still, as long as it works, it's great.
Please leave your message after the tone. Thank you.
Okay.
It goes to voicemail. Okay. Oh, he's calling me. Hold on.
So this must be a great question.
Yeah.
What's going on?
After the tone. Thank
Does he know what you're doing? Does he know that he has to respond?
Tell him to.
Answer your phone.
Mark, answer your phone. Sylvia is calling you.
Sylvia is trying to call you.
No.
No, not yet.
Is there?
There's something in the chat.
There we go.
Okay. I'm in.
Okay.
Oh no.
Okay, I'll have to turn off the. This is complicated because I'm getting an echo here.
Oh yeah. Wait. I have to mute myself. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Could you hang up? Yeah, thank you. So I will try to recap your question really quickly. And so the first instance was about these reparations that were paid by the Italian government. You know, you contrasted that to what happened in the same period of time in 1946 to workers and sailors, British Chinese sailors that were had been employed by the merchant marine, and because they went on strike, they have been suspected of being communist sympathizers and have been deported to China forcibly by being separated from their British wives and their children. And that's a horrendous episode. I confess I didn't know about, and I'm going to look it up because I find it extremely interesting. And you were also saying that the Cunard line was the shipping line that was apparently complicit in this operation, which had also the involvement of the British Secret Service, which is all very fascinating to me, because I'm still in the process of trying to find out exactly how these refugees were repatriated from Italy and other European countries to China. And it's been an extremely difficult research because they were not on passengers' manifests. Being refugees repatriated, they weren't considered passengers at all. So I haven't been able to find. I also looked up the Imperial archives, but I could not find anything about them. So there are some huge UNHCR archives that one could look into, but haven't been able to do so yet. So if I ever find out more about this issue, I will definitely let you know, and I will see if there are, because there are probably, these are two very different political attitudes in a way. The Italian government was fishing for sympathy here, so I would not say that we were like less violent, brutal, or racist than the Brits. I think it was more a question of opportunity here than a question of human decency. But and because I have no idea of how these people were treated while their way on the Otranto steamer. I have no idea. Did they travel, in third class? Were they were they kept on the bridge? I have no idea. So this is certainly a matter that needs more research being done. And sorry, I can't tell you more about this, but that's all I have for now. But thank you for opening up this perspective to me.
Okay, so I think I've taken enough of your time, but I think it was so fascinating that I didn't want to stop it before. And actually, it's just because it's 6, otherwise we could have gone a bit later as well. Before we all thank Daniele, I'm going to use these 2 minutes to advertise events that are coming up. Unfortunately, sorry, Daniele, about this. So first of all, tomorrow we have the book launch of Nicoletta Mandolini. It will happen here, for those of you who are at UCC, at 1 p.m. in the common area of Plus. So at the end,
it's been changed.
It's been changed. Okay, so in the common area here of Italian. And then tomorrow afternoon as well, 2 people from the Italian department will be presenting their research at the memory cluster around 3 p.m. It will be Noreen Kane and Guido Bartolini. So if you want, we will be in Mary Ryan room downstairs. And look, people from Cork, please watch out for the festival, the Italian Film Festival, which will come up on the 19th to the 22nd of May. That said, I've closed all the logistics and all the advertising that I'm doing now, and I want to bring back to the speaker because it was really a fantastic talk, and we're really grateful for having you, Daniele, with us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, students in particular.
If you have any other questions, you feel free to email me at the address that I, wait, I can show it to you again. So real quick. Yeah, I have to share it.
Or you can copy and paste the address in the chat.
Oh yeah, could, yeah, but they can see it. So here it is, Daniele.Cologna at uninsubria.it. Okay.
Thanks. Or you can copy me and I'll pass it.
Oh yeah,
Please,
same
you
thing,
are.
of course.
Thank you
Okay,
so much,
thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.